Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's briefing. For those of you I haven't met, as Emma mentioned, I'm Ross Brennan, Senior Legislative Affairs Associate at the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, him. And I'm going to speak about appropriations and key inflection points to keep in mind as we move through this year's process. So while much of the timeline for the annual appropriations process is set by law, the federal government often doesn't abide by these deadlines, which can make it hard for the public to know when to engage Congress should they want to advocate for particular priorities in their community. So to help explain these important dates, the CPCC put together a rough timeline of key moments during the annual appropriations process, which is on your screen and which I will go through now. So the first step of the appropriations process is setting a budget. So to kick this off, the president first submits a budget to Congress. And by law, the president has to submit a budget for the upcoming fiscal year to Congress by the first Monday in February. However, administrations often miss these deadlines. So for example, the Biden administration intends to submit its 2024 fiscal year budget to Congress next month on March 9th. And the president's budget indicates the administration's spending priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. So for example, the president's 2023 fiscal year budget proposed a 29% boost to the Environmental Protection Agency's budget, which would bring the agency's funding to an all-time high. And while many may appreciate this increase, myself included, unfortunately, the president's budget does not become law. So Congress is free to adopt or ignore the spending levels the administration recommends. So think of it more as like a list of suggestions for spending levels than a binding document that Congress has to adhere to. And then next, Congress considers and passes a budget resolution generally between April and June, which you can see in that next panel there. And this Congress-passed budget resolution is not signed by the president and does not become law. However, most importantly, it does include the total federal funding for the appropriations committees to distribute among different government agencies and programs for the fiscal year. So it's like determining the size of the whole pie before determining the size of the slices, if that makes sense. So this brings us to step 2, writing the appropriations bills. So between March and late April, the Appropriations Committee solicits funding requests from members of Congress. And this is really important because it shows the Appropriations Committee, who actually write the spending bills, how important a given program or agency is to its members. So that's a really crucial step in the process. And so during this time, members circulate letters to appropriators for other members to sign that indicate shared support or opposition to a certain federal program. So like an example, in 2022, members sent an appropriations letter requesting at least $49 billion for the National Institutes of Health for FY23. And members often sign these letters in response to requests from constituents and advocates. So they're really eager to hear from you. Advocates may also ask members to support specific federal projects or earmarks, as they're called, but they're now called congressional directed spending or community project funding. And these are items in appropriations bills for specific local projects in a given member's district. So for example, a member's district may receive funding to expand clean water infrastructure through an earmark, and they're usually sort of smaller physical projects. So next, the House Appropriations Committee's 12 subcommittees begin hearings on federal programs. They release their spending bills to the public, and then they mark up or amend the bills to prepare them for the House floor. Members on the Appropriations Committee can offer amendments to alter the spending levels in the bills or put conditions on the funding before it goes to the full House for a vote. And then also during this time, the Senate Appropriations Committee considers its 12 appropriations bills. The Senate only often considers some of the 12 bills on the Senate floor and instead uses the House-passed appropriations bills as the true starting point for negotiations between the two chambers. And in recent years, the House has introduced and initiated appropriations bills consideration, though the Senate can introduce and pass their own versions if they'd like to. So if all of this goes according to plan, and it rarely does, the House Appropriations Committee finalizes their bills between June and July. Again, it's rare that they get through all bills. After that, the bills go to the full House for consideration. In recent years, the Senate hasn't considered any individual appropriations bills on the Senate floor, and again, generally acts on a House-passed package of all 12 appropriations bills or a compromise package that both chambers have negotiated between each other. So next, I'm going to focus on what happens on the House floor, usually between June and July. So the floor amendment process allows all House members to modify an appropriations bill. Members could introduce an amendment to increase funding for a program, decrease funding, or put conditions on the funding. So for example, a member could offer an amendment stipulating that no funding in the bill could be used to construct a border wall, for example. However, amendment opportunities depend on the rule structure, meaning the House-approved resolution that sets parameters for debate on the House floor. Some rules may let any member introduce an amendment on the floor, while others may only allow a limited number of amendments or none at all. Additionally, amendments must adhere to certain rules about the kinds of items included in the appropriations bills. It's also important to highlight that during this process, members may seek to add or remove longstanding policy riders through a floor amendment. And policy riders are provisions that attach directives or conditions on funding, and they can modify existing laws or implement new initiatives. And this is a way to advance policy goals without having to pass standalone legislation. So, for example, a member may offer an amendment to repeal the prohibition that for decades has barred specific healthcare programs from covering abortion care, which is known as the Hyde Amendment. And then by August, the Senate and House usually have voted on some or rarely all appropriations bills. The House and the Senate will sometimes pass different versions of the same appropriations legislation. And in these cases, the two chambers will convene what's known as a conference committee composed of representatives and senators to reconcile differences between the two bills. This conferencing often happens behind the scenes, meaning that representatives and senators develop a compromise bill through private negotiations without formal committee hearings. And that compromise package has to pass both the House and the Senate before it become law. And so finally, this brings us to the final step, which is finalizing the appropriations bills. So the fiscal year ends on September 30th, and the new fiscal year begins on October 1st. So suppose Congress fails to pass one or more appropriations bills by the end of the fiscal year, which again is October 1st. In that case, Congress may pass what is known as a continuing resolution, or CR, to fund the government at the previous fiscal year's spending levels. And a CR doesn't need to last an entire fiscal year. Often Congress will pass a CR to buy more time to negotiate full year appropriations bills. But without a CR or an appropriation bill for the new fiscal year, government funding lapses, resulting in a government shutdown. Obviously not ideal. So in recent years, Congress has not met the October 1st deadline to enact appropriations bills into law, and instead pass a CR to allow more time for negotiations. These CRs have typically lasted through early to mid-December, at which point Congress passes an omnibus spending package containing all 12 appropriations bills for the upcoming fiscal year. For example, in 2022, Congress finalized the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023 on December 23rd. being home in time for the holiday break is a great motivator for Congress to get its work done, which is why an omnibus bill usually gets passed in late December. I know that's a lot of information and that this can be an opaque and frustrating process at times, but I hope that you have a clearer picture of the key moments and inflection points. And if you'd like more information, the CPCC has just released an explainer containing these key dates and an explanation of these steps, which will be dropped in the chat now. Likewise, you can reach out to me with any questions or comments at ross@progressivecaucuscenter.org. And with that, I'll pass it back to Emma. Thanks, everybody.